Step into a kitchen of the past and you'll find your grandparents working patiently over stoves and ovens, turning the simplest ingredients into hearty meals. Stews bubbled slowly, bread baked golden, and puddings filled the air with sweetness. Mealtimes weren't just about eating, but about gathering, sharing, and building memories. One dessert from Grandma needed only 3 simple ingredients that made a masterpiece. Keep watching to find out which one. Here are 20 old-fashioned British meals our grandparents made. Starting with the classic, 1 golden apple pie. Back in the day, no farmhouse table felt complete without a golden apple pie cooling on the sill. Folks knew the trick wasn't in fancy spices, but in patience. A slow simmer of orchard apples, just enough sugar, and a flaky crust rolled thin by hand. Your grandparents believed every pie had its own story, some baked for Sunday guests, others to sweeten the sting of hard work in the fields. A golden pie wasn't only dessert, it was a marker of care, warmth, and gathering. Each slice held the crisp tang of autumn and the comfort of knowing nothing went to waste. Bruised apples, windfalls, and all found a home in that dish. When the pie came out of the oven, the smell filled the whole house, carrying a sense of heritage that was passed down as faithfully as the recipe itself. But once this pie was gone, your grandparents often reached for an even better staple. 2. Buttery biscuits. Biscuits weren't treated as casual fare in old kitchens. They were the pride of a cook's skill. Soft inside, crisp on top, and rich with churned butter, these were the kind of breads that could turn scraps of stew into a meal worth remembering. Grandma mixed flour and lard by feel, not by measure, cutting in just enough to create those crumbly layers. They rose in hot, cast-iron pans, their golden tops brushed with butter straight from the crock. Biscuits were breakfast when split open for honey, lunch when paired with ham slices, and supper when smothered in gravy. They travelled in flour sacks to church socials, picnics, and barn dances, where neighbours judged not just the flavour, but the fluff. And yet, even these biscuits could not compete with the sweetness of the next dish. 3. Brown sugar peaches. Summer meant peaches, and your grandparents knew the joy of turning them into something even sweeter. This masterpiece of a dish needed just 3 simple ingredients: peaches, butter, and brown sugar. Grandma sliced ripe peaches and sprinkled them with brown sugar. Then, small pats of butter were dotted on the top. She let this bake until the fruit softened and the syrup thickened. The result was tender peaches bathed in their own caramel-like juices, a dish that could stand on its own or top biscuits, cakes, or custards. Your grandparents treasured this treat that needed only 3 components. The smell of bubbling peaches mixed with sugar filled the kitchen, drawing children in with eager spoons. But once the cool weather rolled in, they'd switch to this next dish that tasted like autumn itself. 4. Warm pumpkin biscuits. Pumpkin biscuits were one of those old-time creations that stretched a harvest into unexpected corners of the table. The pulp was mashed smooth and mixed into biscuit dough, lending it a golden colour and a faint sweetness. Baked hot in wood stoves, they came out tender and fragrant, the kind of food that smelled of falling leaves and chilly mornings. Served warm with butter, they made a fine partner to stews or a sweet treat with molasses drizzled on top. Your grandparents saw them as a thrifty use of what was already on hand, turning a simple biscuit into something richer, softer, and fit for both workday meals and holiday spreads. Still, as much as those biscuits won hearts, the next dish was even richer and downright unforgettable. 5. Honey butter cornbread. Cornbread was always the bread of choice where cornfields stretched across the horizon. But when baked with a drizzle of honey and finished with a pat of melting butter, it turned from humble to heavenly. The honey lent a golden sweetness that played against the grainy bite of cornmeal, while butter seeped into every crumb. This bread was eaten hot, straight from cast iron, sometimes dunked in soup, sometimes topped with fried apples, sometimes enjoyed plain. But even this golden sweetness couldn't compete with the next spread that stood above them all. 6. Rustic bread loaf. A rustic loaf was the everyday bread your grandparents relied on to keep the household fed. Grandma would stir flour, water, and salt together in a wooden bowl, worn smooth from years of use. The dough rose on the back of the stove, covered with a faded towel, while chores carried on. By the time the oven was hot, the dough had doubled, ready to be shaped into sturdy loaves. The crust baked hard and brown, perfect for slicing thick to hold butter, jam, or meat scraps. This was the kind of bread that travelled well in lunch pails and held up to stews. But while a rustic loaf was dependable, the next dish turned scraps into something richer and far more comforting. 7. Hearty ham soup. When a ham bone was left from Sunday supper, your grandparents never wasted it. Into the pot it went, surrounded by onions, carrots and beans to simmer until every bit of flavour was drawn out. Grandma let the soup bubble slow on the stove, filling the house with a smell that promised comfort. The broth turned rich and smoky, thickened by potatoes or split peas depending on what the garden and pantry offered. Served hot with bread on the side, it became a whole meal that warmed tired hands. Neighbours often remarked that nothing fed a family so cheaply yet so richly as ham soup. What began as leftovers was transformed into something hearty, filling, and fit to share. As filling as ham soup was, the next pot bubbling on the stove carried even more warmth. 8. Creamy potato chowder. On cold evenings, your grandparents often turned to potato chowder for supper. Potatoes were plentiful, stored away in cellars to last the winter, and Grandma knew just how to make them shine. She diced them small, simmering them with milk, onions, and bits of bacon until the pot grew thick and velvety. The chowder clung to spoons and filled bowls with comforting steam. It was the kind of meal that wrapped the body in warmth from the inside out. Sometimes, corn was added for sweetness, or cheese grated on top for richness. Your grandparents prized this chowder because it could feed many mouths with little cost, stretching a few humble potatoes into a feast. But even this creamy chowder couldn't compete with the flavour packed into the next dish. 9. Garden tomato sauce. When tomatoes ripened faster than they could be eaten fresh, your grandparents wasted no time turning them into jars of sauce. Grandma peeled and crushed the fruit by hand, stirring in herbs she grew by the kitchen door. The sauce simmered on the stove for hours, thickening slowly, filling the air with the smell of basil, garlic, and sweet tomatoes. This sauce dressed noodles, stewed with meat, or flavoured soups, and every use carried the memory of sunshine. The pantry shelves glowed red with rows of jars, each one labelled and stored with prid. When the snow fell, a simple meal of pasta with this sauce was enough to keep the whole family fed. And while tomato sauce brought summer to the table, the next dish proved even the humblest vegetable could shine bright. 10. Savoury cabbage sauté. Cabbage was never overlooked in your grandparents' kitchen. Though humble, it was one of the most versatile vegetables they grew. Grandma would slice it thin and sauté it in bacon fat or butter until it turned tender and golden at the edges. The result was simple yet hearty, a side dish that paired with nearly any meal. Sometimes onions or vinegar were added for extra bite, other times a sprinkle of pepper gave it warmth. Sautéed cabbage showed up beside roasts tucked into sandwiches or served plain in big bowls. It was the kind of dish that didn't need much effort and yet tasted delicious. Still, cabbage had nothing on our next dish. 11. Rich beef stew. When the weather turned sharp and fields lay quiet, your grandparents brought out the stew pot. Grandma browned beef chunks slowly, letting the aroma build before adding carrots, onions, and potatoes from the cellar. She poured in broth, covered the pot, and let it bubble on the back burner for hours. The meat softened, the vegetables soaked up the juices, and the whole mixture grew into a stew thick enough to feed a crowd. Your grandparents leaned on this dish during long winters. A ladleful over bread or alongside biscuits was enough to fill bellies after chores. Yet even this thick and savoury stew could not measure up to our next dish. 12. Slow bean pot. Beans were the patient food of your grandparents' kitchen. They didn't mind the soaking, the long simmer, or the waiting because beans stretched further than almost anything else. Grandma would tuck navy beans, pintos, or whatever was on hand into a heavy crock, stirring in onions, molasses, and a scrap of bacon for depth. She set the pot in the oven or on the stove, letting it cook low all day. By supper, the beans were tender, flavoured through and through, and ready to ladle into bowls. Your grandparents knew this dish well. It filled stomachs on lean weeks and always tasted better the second day. Although these beans filled bellies well enough, the next dish outdid them entirely. 13. Tangy sourdough starter. Your grandparents treated sourdough starter almost like a living family member. Grandma fed it daily with flour and water, watching the bubbles form as it breathed on the countertop. She guarded the crock with care, knowing that a healthy starter meant endless loaves, pancakes, and biscuits. The smell was tangy, the texture alive, and to her it held the flavor of continuity. Dough rising in her kitchen just as it had in her mother's before. When neighbors visited, Grandma often shared a scoop. She trusted sourdough because it needed little more than flour and patience, yet gave back endlessly. But even this sourdough was outshone by the next remedy that promised comfort in every spoon. 14. Healing elderberry syrup. When colds crept through the family, your grandparents didn't reach first for bottles from a shop. They turned to elderberries boiled down into a thick, dark syrup sweetened with honey. Grandma kept jars of it lined in the pantry, ready to pour into spoons for children with coughs or adults worn from the weather. The taste was sharp yet soothing, a blend of fruit and sweetness that lingered on the tongue. Your grandparents swore by its healing power, claiming it warded off illness when the season shifted. As soothing as syrup was, it had nothing on the next dessert that sweetened every gathering. 15. Gooey pecan pie. Your grandparents saved pecan pie for occasions of celebration. Grandma mixed dark syrup, eggs, and butter until the filling shimmered, then poured it over nuts nestled in a flaky crust. When baked, the pie emerged gooey in the middle, crunchy on top, a balance of indulgence and simplicity. This pie wasn't for every day. It came out at gatherings and holidays. The taste was rich, almost candy-like, yet grounded in the plain pecans that grew nearby. A slice was thick, chewy, and sweet enough to leave children grinning, making any celebration brighter. But even this gooey delight had to bow down to our next pie. 16. Spiced squash pie. When autumn rolled in, your grandparents turned garden squash into pies that rivaled pumpkin. Grandma roasted the flesh until tender, mashed it smooth, and mixed it with eggs, cream, and spice. Cinnamon, nutmeg, and clove gave the filling warmth, while a flaky crust held it together like a cradle. The pie baked golden, its aroma drifting through the house as a promise of comfort. The texture was velvety, the flavor earthy yet rich, a perfect match for cool evenings and warm kitchens. Served plain or topped with whipped cream, it carried a taste like nothing else. As comforting as squash pie was, this next dish went bigger, brighter, and sweeter. 17. Cozy sweet casserole. Your grandparents saved sweet potato casserole for gatherings when the table needed a centerpiece. Grandma boiled the potatoes until soft, whipped them with butter, sugar, and a dash of spice, then spread them into a pan. A topping of toasted pecans or marshmallows crowned the dish, turning it into something part vegetable, part dessert. When it came out bubbling hot, the smell filled the house with warmth and sweetness. Children dove in for the topping, while grown-ups savored the rich filling beneath. Grandma's version carried her signature touch, whether it was extra cinnamon or a thicker crust of nuts. Every bite was soft, comforting, and celebratory. While this casserole drew a lot of praise, the next dish took a plain veggie and made it shimmer with sweetness. 18. Maple glazed carrots. Carrots were never just boiled plain in your grandparents' kitchen. Grandma often sliced them into coins, simmered them gently, and finished with a glaze of butter and maple syrup. The result was tender carrots shimmering with sweetness, tasting of earth and autumn woods. These glazed carrots often appeared on holiday tables, their bright orange a cheerful contrast against heavy meats and gravies. Children especially favored them, and the maple flavor got smiles from even picky eaters. Grandma's pan of glossy carrots was proof that not every dish needed to be complicated, but just a thoughtful touch of sweetness. As glossy as those carrots looked, the next dish was even more wholesome. 19. Herbed garlic potatoes. Potatoes were at the center of many meals your grandparents prepared, but Grandma knew how to dress them up beyond plain boiling. She sliced them thick, tossed them with butter, garlic, and sprigs of herbs from the garden, then roasted them until crisp at the edges. The smell of rosemary and thyme clung to the kitchen, making mouths water long before supper was ready. These potatoes were hearty enough to stand beside roasts, soups, or casseroles, yet flavorful enough to steal attention on their own. Grandma's roasted batches always carried that golden crunch outside and soft, steamy center within. Still, even these potatoes couldn't outshine this next dish. 20. Smooth pumpkin puree. Your grandparents didn't let pumpkins sit long once harvest came. Grandma cut them open, scooped the seeds for roasting, and boiled the flesh until soft. Then with steady hands she mashed and pressed it through a sieve, transforming rough chunks into a smooth puree. This golden base became the heart of countless dishes, pies, breads, custards, and even savory soups. Jars of it filled the cellar shelves, sealed tight for the cold months ahead. Its flavor was mild, yet comforting, adaptable to sweet or savory needs. And while this puree was versatile, our next spread outdid it effortlessly. 21. Spiced apple butter. Your grandparents treated apple butter as a treasure of the pantry. Grandma would cook apples down slowly in a heavy pot, stirring until they melted into a thick, dark spread. Cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg gave it warmth, while sugar brought out the fruit's natural sweetness. Hours of simmering transformed simple apples into something smooth and fragrant, rich enough to spread on bread or biscuits. The process was slow, filling the house with a comforting scent that lingered long after the jars cooled. Grandma stacked those jars proudly on the shelf, knowing they would sweeten breakfasts and suppers. As rich and warming as apple butter was, the next sweet dish rose even higher. 22. Sweet potato bread. When sweet potatoes were plentiful, your grandparents turned them into more than casseroles. Grandma mashed them into bread dough, adding butter, eggs, and a touch of spice. The loaves baked up moist, golden, and fragrant, carrying both the heartiness of bread and the sweetness of cake. Slices were perfectly toasted with butter or served plain alongside soup. This wasn't an everyday loaf. It was the kind baked for gatherings, when Grandma wanted to put something on the table that felt both comforting and a little indulgent. As delicious as that bread was, the next dish went beyond, turning corn into something festive. 23. Cheesy corn pudding. Corn was always central to your grandparents' meals, but Grandma knew how to make it shine beyond bread or porridge. She whipped kernels with eggs, cream, and cheese, then baked it into a casserole that came out golden and bubbling. The pudding was soft inside, crisp at the edges, and brimming with flavor. Your grandparents served it as a side for Sunday dinners or holiday spreads, where it always stole attention from the main dish. Its richness made it feel extra festive. Grandma's touch was in the balance, not too sweet, not too heavy, but hearty enough to fill everyone's plates with satisfaction. As rich and festive as pudding was, the next creation outshined it completely. 24. Fluffy yeast rolls. The making of yeast rolls was something of a ritual. Your grandparents swore that bread had a temperament, rising slow or fast depending on the day's weather. Rolls were kneaded until the dough sang back under the palm, then left to rise beneath a cloth towel warmed by the stove. Yeast rolls were Sunday dinner essentials, torn apart beside roast beef or ladled full of gravy. They were also the first taste of independence for many children, learning to shape little balls of dough with flour-dusted fingers. But even those pillowy rolls couldn't top the final dish, the broth that healed and comforted more than anything else. 25. Comfort chicken broth. When sickness or weariness struck, your grandparents turned to chicken broth. Grandma simmered bones, onions, celery, and carrots for hours, skimming the pot until the liquid grew clear and golden. The broth was sipped plain from mugs or used as a base for soups and stews. Its warmth soothed throats, eased stomachs, and brought comfort beyond simple nourishment. Your grandparents swore by its healing touch, insisting a bowl could cure more than medicine ever did. Even on ordinary days, chicken broth was a staple, stretching scraps into meals, filling jars for later, or flavoring dumplings and rice. Grandma kept some always at hand, knowing it was as essential as bread or butter. Which of these wholesome British meals do you still remember? Let us know in the comments below. If you learnt something new today, please hit subscribe. See you in the next one.